They weren't glamorous. They weren't made for box office glory. These were the war films that veterans, men who actually lived the chaos, said, got it right. The grit, the fear, the brotherhood, the silence before a shell lands. Forgotten by modern audiences, these films dared to tell the truth when Hollywood preferred heroics. But some were too real, and quietly disappeared. Number 15, The Hill, 1965. When The Hill premiered, audiences didn't know what to make of it. Starring Sean Connery at the height of his Bond fame, it stripped away every trace of glamour. This was no tale of medals or victory. It was about cruelty within your own ranks. Set in a brutal British military prison in the North African desert, The Hill follows soldiers punished by their own army. They're forced to climb a man-made hill over and over under the scorching sun, breaking their bodies for discipline. Connery's character, Sergeant Roberts, refuses to obey inhuman orders and pays dearly. Veterans later said it was the only film that captured how authority could crush men just as war did. The realism was suffocating. The film was banned on several bases for undermining morale. The British Army publicly condemned it, calling it anti-military. Behind the scenes, tensions mirrored the story. Director Sidney Lumet pushed his actors to exhaustion in real desert heat. Connery clashed with producers who feared tarnishing his Bond image. But the actor insisted. It was the most honest role he'd ever played. Critics in 1965 were divided, yet soldiers wrote letters praising its authenticity. The film faded from theaters, too bleak for mainstream audiences, but later resurfaced as a masterpiece of psychological warfare. It wasn't about fighting the enemy. It was about surviving your own side. Number 14, Cross of Iron, 1977. Sam Peckinpah's Cross of Iron was chaos incarnate, just like the war it depicted. Released in 1977, it told the story of German soldiers on the Eastern Front. No glory, no victory, just exhaustion, blood, and disillusionment. James Coburn stars as Sergeant Steiner, a weary officer who despises the aristocratic captain sent to command him. When orders turn suicidal, Steiner's rebellion becomes a metaphor for every soldier's disgust with politics and class hierarchy. Veterans who'd seen combat in Europe were stunned. They said it was the only war film that smelled like mud and fear. The camera work was dizzying, the explosions real, and the moral rot unmistakable. Yet, it offended nearly everyone. In West Germany, critics accused it of humanizing Nazis. In America, studios panicked at its bleak tone. Peckinpah, already infamous for his violent films, fell into heavy drinking during the shoot. His constant battles with producers nearly destroyed the film. When it premiered, Cross of Iron flopped in the US. But soldiers recognized its raw truth. In Eastern Europe and Russia, it became a cult classic, an anti-war legend screened privately in military clubs. Its legacy endured quietly. Quentin Tarantino once called it criminally underrated. Veterans called it too real for comfort. Peckinpah's career never recovered, but Cross of Iron remains the only film that dared to show World War II from the losing side's mud-caked trenches, with brutal, unfiltered humanity. Number 13, The Steel Helmet, 1951. Before the Korean War was even over, the steel helmet arrived, and Washington wasn't happy. Directed by Samuel Fuller, a World War II veteran himself, it was shot in just 10 days on a shoestring budget. Yet, it became one of the first truly authentic portrayals of war's moral decay. The film follows Sergeant Zach, Gene Evans, a battle-hardened survivor trying to lead a ragtag squad through Korea. The soldiers are cynical, exhausted, and unsure who the enemy really is. Fuller, who had fought at Normandy, infused every scene with what he called the stink of war. But it was the dialogue that caused outrage. When a black soldier questions why he's fighting for a country that still treats him as second class, Congress took notice. The U.S. Army condemned the film for disloyalty. Fuller was investigated by the FBI. Behind the camera, Fuller shot with real veterans using leftover war equipment. The helmets, mud, and rations were all authentic. He even risked censorship by showing American soldiers committing questionable acts, something unheard of in 1951. Audiences were divided. Some called it treasonous. Others, especially veterans, called it the first movie that told the truth. The film disappeared from theaters quickly, but lived on in film schools and underground screenings. Today, the steel helmet is hailed as the first great American anti-war film. Fuller once said, "If you've seen war, you'll never again believe in clean hands." Veterans nodded. They'd already known. Number 12. The Big Red One, 1980. By the time The Big Red One hit theaters in 1980, it was already a ghost of what its director intended. Samuel Fuller, yes, the same veteran who made the steel helmet, spent decades trying to tell his own story of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, through a lens of weary humanity rather than Hollywood valor. Lee Marvin, himself a veteran of the Pacific War, played the battle-scarred sergeant leading his men from North Africa to Normandy. The film chronicled the war not as a crusade, but as a long, bloody endurance test. Its tone was matter-of-fact. War wasn't glory, it was repetition, fear, and survival. But studio interference gutted it. Warner Bros. Slashed Fuller's 3-hour cut down to a brisk 2, ripping away much of its emotional depth. Veterans who attended early screenings said it was too quiet, too real. Critics didn't understand it. It bombed commercially. Behind the scenes, the production mirrored Fuller's own frustration with war, budget cuts, disagreements, and his refusal to glamorize killing. Lee Marvin, suffering from alcoholism and PTSD, reportedly broke down during a scene depicting liberated concentration camps. Decades later, a restored director's cut resurfaced, finally revealing Fuller's intended version. Veterans hailed it as one of the most authentic depictions of camaraderie and endurance. Unlike propaganda-laden war epics, The Big Red One showed the exhaustion between battles, the boredom, the small jokes, the endless march. It's not about who wins, it's about who makes it home. Fuller, who saw war firsthand, said it best. Surviving doesn't make you lucky, it makes you haunted. Number 11, Tunes of Glory, 1960. At first glance, Tunes of Glory looks like a quiet post-war drama, but beneath its stately Scottish bagpipes lies one of the most devastating depictions of military pride and emotional collapse ever filmed. Released in 1960, the film stars Alec Guinness and John Mills as two officers locked in psychological warfare within a Highland regiment after World War II. One is a war hero, the other a by-the-book disciplinarian. Their clash becomes a slow-motion tragedy. Veterans recognize the truth instantly, the trauma that doesn't end when the guns fall silent. It's about men who can't let go of command, who only feel alive within the structure of war. The drinking, the loneliness, the haunting sense of pointlessness. It was too real for comfort. There was no censorship, but the British Army quietly discouraged screenings on bases, calling it damaging to morale. Many officers despised how it portrayed command as fragile and self-destructive. Behind the scenes, Alec Guinness was at his peak, but the intensity of his role drove him to insomnia. John Mills later said, "We were acting out ghosts, our fathers and our own." Though praised by critics, Tunes of Glory vanished into art house obscurity. Only veterans and film historians kept it alive. Today it's recognized as one of the finest anti-war films ever made, without showing a single battlefield. Because sometimes, the hardest war is the one you fight after the war ends. Number 10. A Walk in the Sun, 1945. While America was still at war, one film dared to show it without the gloss, A Walk in the Sun. Released in 1945, it followed a platoon of U.S. soldiers slogging through Italy. Not in triumph, but confusion. The men bicker, joke, panic, and pray as they march toward an objective none of them fully understand. There are no sweeping speeches or orchestral glory, just heat, dust, and exhaustion. The war feels endless, mechanical, absurd. For audiences fed on patriotic propaganda, it was shocking. Some theaters pulled it from circulation after veterans called it too real. Military censors disliked its lack of heroism, labeling it defeatist. But to actual soldiers, it was gold. The film's writer, Philip Stevenson, was blacklisted soon after. His work was deemed un-American during the Red Scare. Director Louis Milestone, himself an immigrant and veteran, fought to preserve the realism, even using real combat footage as visual reference. Behind the camera, actors rehearsed in real mud pits and endured scorching conditions to mimic battle fatigue. One studio executive allegedly called it too depressing to sell popcorn, Decades later, war historians rediscovered it. Veterans still say, A Walk in the Sun captures the real rhythm of war better than any blockbuster. It's about marching towards something you don't believe in, but marching anyway. Because sometimes survival isn't about courage, it's about continuing to walk when you don't know why. Number 9. Hell in the Pacific, 1968. When Hell in the Pacific premiered in 1968, it broke every rule of war cinema. There were no armies, no flags, and barely any dialogue. Just two men stranded on an island, forced to confront the futility of everything they'd been taught to hate. Lee Marvin, an American veteran, plays a downed U.S. pilot. Opposite him stands Toshiro Mifune, a Japanese naval officer. Both men are trapped on a desolate Pacific island during World War II, locked in an endless cycle of hostility, survival, and reluctant cooperation. Veterans immediately understood what the film was saying. The real enemy wasn't each other. It was the machinery of war itself. Yet many critics at the time didn't. American audiences found it strange and unpatriotic. Japanese reviewers said it was too raw. The studio panicked over its bleak tone. They even shot two different endings, one hopeful, one tragic. The U.S. release chose the bleaker version, both men destroyed just as they begin to understand each other. In Japan, a more ambiguous finale was used. Behind the scenes, Marvin and Mifune, both real veterans, struggled to communicate, using translators and mutual respect instead. Their on-screen tension wasn't acting. It was genuine, born from history itself. Though a box office disappointment, Hell in the Pacific became a quiet legend among servicemen. Many called it the only film that truly captured the loneliness of war, the absurdity of two men trapped in their government's hatred. It asks the hardest question of all. If two soldiers could find peace, why couldn't their nations? Number 8. The Cruel Sea, 1953. For sailors who fought in World War II, The Cruel Sea was more than a movie. It was memory. Released in 1953, it was based on Nicholas Montserrat's novel and depicted life aboard a British corvette hunting submarines in the North Atlantic. There are no glamorous victories here, just relentless cold, fear, and fatigue. Jack Hawkins stars as Captain Erickson, a man tormented by decisions that cost lives. In one harrowing scene, he orders depth charges dropped on enemy subs, knowing his own men are in the water. Veterans called it too close to home. Many couldn't finish the film. Naval officers confirmed that the story mirrored countless real incidents kept classified for decades. Some screening events for ex-servicemen ended in silence rather than applause. The Admiralty praised its accuracy, but disliked its emotional honesty. For years, it was quietly sidelined in official circles, too grim for recruitment propaganda. Behind the scenes, filming was brutal. Real Royal Navy ships were used, and the cast endured freezing conditions. Hawkins suffered frostbite during shooting, but insisted on completing the scene. Director Charles Friend refused to add melodrama, saying, "The sea itself is the villain." Critics hailed it as the truest sea film ever made. But the public, still recovering from post-war trauma, stayed away. It faded into quiet respect, later revived by naval veterans who screened it at remembrance gatherings. The ocean doesn't take sides. It only consumes. That's what The Cruel Sea dared to show. Number 7. The Bridge at Remagen, 1969. By the late 1960s, war movies had grown bombastic again. But The Bridge at Remagen did something different. It stripped away heroism and showed World War II's final days through chaos, exhaustion, and confusion. Set in March 1945, it follows American forces racing to capture Germany's last intact bridge across the Rhine before it's destroyed. George Segal and Robert Vaughn lead opposing sides, both men just trying to survive as the world collapses around them. Veterans praised its realism. There were no clean uniforms, no speeches, no morale. Soldiers moved like ghosts through bombed-out towns, unsure what they were dying for now that victory was certain. One veteran wrote to the studio, "This is how it really felt, pointless but necessary." But the film's production was cursed. Shot in Czechoslovakia, it was interrupted by the Soviet invasion of 1968. The cast and crew barely escaped before the borders closed. Some sets were seized by local troops. Extras disappeared into political detention. The chaos mirrored the story itself, a bridge between hope and ruin. When released, it was banned across several Eastern Bloc nations for Western propaganda, though ironically, many soldiers in those countries traded black market copies. It didn't glamorize war. It showed the futility of men fighting for ground that didn't matter anymore. When the real Remagen veterans watched it, many wept. They said it captured what most films refused to, that by the war's end, nobody felt like a hero, just survivors counting the hours until silence returned. Number 6. Attack, 1956. Few films have the nerve to accuse their own military of that moral cowardice, but Attack did exactly that. Released in 1956, directed by Robert Aldrich, this intense drama ripped apart the myth of leadership under fire. Jack Palance stars as Lieutenant Costa, a brave yet furious officer who watches his incompetent captain, Eddie Albert, repeatedly send men to their deaths because of fear. When command politics cost lives, Costa swears revenge, not against the enemy, but against the man wearing his own uniform. Audiences were stunned. This wasn't about heroics. It was about betrayal within the ranks. Veterans immediately recognized the truth. Not all officers were heroes, and not every soldier trusted the chain of command. The U.S. Army despised it, calling it insubordinate fiction. Military bases banned screenings, and Aldrich was labeled anti-American. Behind the scenes, tension ran deep. Palance, a real veteran of the Air Force, reportedly channeled his wartime trauma into his explosive performance. Eddie Albert, ironically also a decorated veteran, struggled to play a coward, telling reporters, "I hated myself every day on that set." Critics praised its unflinching intensity, but distributors grew nervous. It was pulled from wide circulation and faded into cult status among servicemen. European audiences, however, embraced it, recognizing its honesty about power, fear, and moral decay. In later years, veterans praised Attack for showing something other films never dared: the idea that sometimes the most dangerous man in battle isn't the enemy with a rifle, but the coward with authority. It's not just a war film, it's a moral reckoning with leadership itself. Number 5. The Thin Red Line, 1998. Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line wasn't a typical war movie. It was a meditation on existence wrapped in the chaos of Guadalcanal. Released in 1998, it divided audiences but earned deep reverence from veterans who called it the closest thing to what war feels like in the mind. Unlike other war epics, it had no central hero. Instead, it wove the thoughts of multiple soldiers, fear, awe, confusion, into one haunting narrative. Starring Sean Penn, Jim Caviezel, and Nick Nolte, it portrayed soldiers not as warriors, but as fragile souls adrift in a world turned savage. The cinematography was dreamlike, almost spiritual, but that beauty carried a paradox, the horror beneath the jungle's calm. Veterans said it mirrored the dissociation of combat, how nature stays serene while men lose their sanity. Hollywood didn't know how to market it. It opened just months after Saving Private Ryan, which glorified chaos with blood-soaked realism. Malick's quiet, philosophical approach baffled mainstream audiences, yet struck a nerve with real soldiers. Many wrote letters calling it the most honest depiction of our thoughts in battle. Behind the scenes, the production was chaotic. Malick shot over 1 million feet of film, cutting entire performances, including Adrian Brody's, to mere seconds. Studio executives panicked over its pacing and voiceovers, but Malick refused to compromise. Though divisive upon release, The Thin Red Line grew into a masterpiece of introspection. It doesn't ask what war is, but why it exists, and whether the human soul can ever return unchanged. War may end on paper, but in the mind, it echoes forever. Number 4. The Train, 1964. When John Frankenheimer's The Train premiered in 1964, critics called it a thinking man's action movie. Veterans, however, saw something deeper. A story about sacrifice, duty, and the strange obsession men have with what war destroys, and what it preserves. Set during the final days of Nazi occupation, Burt Lancaster stars as a French resistance fighter trying to stop a German colonel, Paul Schofield, from stealing France's priceless art treasures by train. The premise sounds simple, But it's war stripped to its essence, a battle for meaning. Frankenheimer shot real trains colliding, with Lancaster performing his own dangerous stunts. There were no miniatures, no trickery, just raw physical destruction that symbolized the moral wreckage of Europe itself. Behind the scenes, the film was nearly canceled after director Arthur Penn was fired mid-production. Lancaster, himself a World War II veteran, insisted on continuing under Frankenheimer, who rewrote the script to focus less on art and more on human endurance. The result was breathtakingly tense and morally complex. Veterans applauded its depiction of duty without glory. One reviewer wrote, "It's the only war film that makes you question what's worth dying for." Some countries, however, disliked its message. In France, censors demanded changes to avoid portraying the resistance as fractured. In Germany, distributors delayed release, fearing it might reopen old wounds. Over time, the train faded into history, overshadowed by flashier war movies. But among veterans, it became legend, proof that bravery isn't about killing or winning. It's about holding on to civilization's soul, even as the world burns around you. The art on that train wasn't just culture, it was everything humanity stands to lose when war takes over. Home. Number 2, King and Country, 1964. Few war films have dared to confront their own army as boldly as King and Country. Directed by Joseph Losey, this bleak masterpiece takes place in the sodden trenches of the First World War, where the real battle isn't against the Germans, but against the system that eats its own men alive. Tom Courtenay plays Private Hamp, a simple, shell-shocked soldier who walks away from the front for 48 hours, his first act of defiance after years in the mud. Dirk Bogarde is Captain Hargreaves, the officer assigned to defend him at a court-martial for desertion. What begins as duty slowly becomes horror, as Hargreaves realizes the justice he's sworn to serve is nothing more than ritualized cruelty. Veterans saw themselves in Hamp's trembling confusion. They said it was the first film to show what happened when bravery ran dry and command refused to understand. Filmed in claustrophobic black and white inside dripping sets, every frame feels like decay made visible mud, rot, futility. The British Army despised it. The BBC refused to air it for years, calling it demoralizing. Behind the camera, Losey, a blacklisted American exile, used handheld shots and real WWI diaries to capture the madness of bureaucracy and uniform. The film ends with Hamp's execution in a downpour, the camera fixed not on the firing squad, but on the faces forced to watch. For veterans, King and Country remains a devastating reminder that sometimes courage dies not in battle, but in silence, under orders. Number 1, Paths of Glory, 1957. No list of truthful war films is complete without Paths of Glory. Stanley Kubrick's masterpiece, released in 1957, shattered illusions about valor, command, and justice. Kirk Douglas stars as Colonel Dax, a French officer ordered to lead his men in a suicidal assault during World War I. When they inevitably fail, 3 soldiers are chosen at random to be executed for cowardice. It's not about bravery, it's about politics, pride, and cruelty disguised as discipline. The French government banned the film for nearly 20 years. Generals called it an insult to the army. NATO allies were pressured not to screen it in Europe. Even some veterans groups in America rejected it, until they saw it for themselves. Then everything changed. Real soldiers recognized their own experiences, the blind arrogance of command, the futility of orders, the horror of dying for someone else's reputation. One veteran wrote to Kubrick, "You showed the truth we were never allowed to speak." Behind the scenes, Kubrick's perfectionism pushed everyone to the limit. Douglas later said, "He didn't want us to act heroes. He wanted us to act human." The result was raw, emotional devastation. When it finally resurfaced in France in the late 70s, old soldiers attended screenings and openly wept. It became the ultimate anti-war statement, not by condemning soldiers, but by showing how institutions sacrifice them. Decades later, Paths of Glory remains the film most veterans say got it painfully, perfectly right. It reminds us that the true enemy isn't always across the battlefield. It's often the system that sends you there. War cinema often paints courage in bright colors, but the veterans who lived it remember only the gray. These forgotten films dared to strip away myth and show the cost of survival. Which of these brutal masterpieces have you seen or never heard of until now? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more hidden history.